The 10 most dangerous motorcycles that are collapsing. They once ruled the road, loud, fast, untouchable. But today, these legendary machines are falling apart, both in the showroom and in spirit. From spine-snapping power to reputations built on fear, these are 10 of the most dangerous motorcycles ever built, and they're collapsing fast. Harley-Davidson. The name once rumbled through the highways of America with the force of a national anthem. Harley-Davidson wasn't a company. It was a cause, a chrome-plated declaration of grit and freedom. For decades, it roared alongside the blue-collar dream, selling not only motorcycles, but the promise of brotherhood, independence, and a distinctly American swagger that couldn't be faked. But those echoes are growing faint. The shine is still there, but the soul has started to rust. In recent years, machines that originally stood for grit and accessibility have shifted toward an entirely different tier. Entry-level motorcycles, previously tailored for riders chasing the thrill of open air and stripped-down machinery, now carry sticker prices exceeding $13,000 before factoring in dealer costs or add-ons. Tack on shipping, dealer premiums, and accessory packages, and you're staring down a $17,000 reality for what used to be a blue jeans machine. At the upper end, touring models have breached the $40,000 threshold, drifting into luxury pricing while clinging to a heritage forged in working-class rebellion. It's no longer about access to the open road. It's about access to a certain tax bracket. Beneath the badge, the story doesn't improve. While rivals march forward with liquid-cooled engines, advanced ride assists, and digital interfaces, Harley clings to its air-cooled Milwaukee 8, a power plant long past its prime. Instrument clusters remain analog and familiar, but in a way that signals reluctance, not reverence. What once brought riders together now risks pushing new generations away. The company's core audience is aging, and with each passing year, the next wave of motorcyclists finds fewer reasons to buy into a lifestyle that seems more costume than calling. Meanwhile, the competition hasn't been idle. Indian and Yamaha offer bikes with sharper lines, better tech, and more adaptable riding experiences. Honda leans hard into innovation, pairing performance with practicality. On the used market, a near-decade-old Road Glide still commands $15,000 and delivers nearly the same ride as today's model, making it harder to justify buying new. Harley's attempt at reinvention, the Livewire, sputtered on arrival. Though the Revolution Max engine brought hope, its promise was marooned, introduced in isolation rather than transformation. The problem isn't design or dollars alone. It's erosion from within. When a brand becomes so married to its own mythology that it forgets how to speak to the future, it drifts into parody. Harley-Davidson isn't faltering because it lost its audience. It's faltering because it mistook nostalgia for relevance and watched the road disappear behind it. Indian Motorcycles. How does a legendary name rise from the ashes only to start dimming its own flame? That's the strange tale of Indian Motorcycles, a company that thundered back into the market with the promise of legacy and muscle, but now finds itself hesitating at the edge of an identity crisis. Reborn under the watchful eye and deep investment of Polaris Industries, Indian returned not as a shadow of its former self, but as a refined powerhouse. Its machines carried the weight of heritage and the hunger of modern engineering. For a fleeting period, Indian wasn't simply back on the map, it was threatening to redraw it entirely. Their cruisers roared with a distinctive blend of old-world elegance and new-age aggression. Riders were drawn to more than the engines. They were drawn to the symbolism stitched into the brand's DNA. The bold lines, the rumbling torque, and above all, the signature multicolored headdress logo that had adorned tanks for generations. It all pointed to something deeper than machinery. To many, that emblem wasn't decoration. It was a lifeline to American motorcycling's golden roots. But then, in February 2023, something shifted. Behind closed doors, Indian issued a memo. The iconic emblem would be retired, replaced with a pared-down, monochromatic version intended to align with corporate rebranding goals and cultural sensitivity. Whatever the intention, the result landed with a thud. Forums ignited. Loyalists voiced their dismay. For them, it wasn't about logos or paint. It was about trust, lineage, and meaning. Without the symbol, Indian appeared unsure of its own story. This decision came at a particularly delicate time. Indian had been gaining traction with a new generation of riders, those drawn to stripped-down models like the Scout Bobber and the FTR, bikes that broke from chrome-heavy tradition and leaned into urban boldness. But that younger audience also comes with keen eyes for authenticity. The logo shift, whether fair or not, signaled hesitation rather than vision. And hesitation in this business is a costly thing. Unlike its larger rivals, Indian's dealer network remains narrow. It doesn't have the reach of Honda or the built-in loyalty of Harley, which means its brand identity carries heavier weight. It's not just decoration, it's survival. The moment the foundation cracked, questions began to surface. Dealers scrambled to control the narrative. Customers grew wary. The bikes themselves, still finely engineered, but engineering alone can't sell soul. And, in the motorcycle world, soul is currency. Indian now stands at a narrowing fork in the road. The next move matters more than ever, because in this line of work, the moment self-doubt creeps into the image projected to the public, riders begin scanning the horizon for something more certain. Moto Guzzi. Moto Guzzi isn't crashing. It's drifting downward in plain sight, like a tired swan circling a lake it can no longer leave. Formerly regarded as a showcase of Italian craftsmanship and personality, Moto Guzzi now drifts between legacy and uncertainty, with each passing year adding to the weight of stagnation. Where dealers once welcomed eager visitors, display floors now dim under fluorescent lights with little foot traffic. Components arrive late. Retailers quietly disappear from directories, fading without notice. This decline doesn't shout, it whispers. And the industry is listening, but not intervening. Founded in 1921 and still producing motorcycles from its original factory on the banks of Lake Como, Moto Guzzi carries a lineage that most brands would envy. Over the decades, its motorcycles embodied something rare, a blend of industrial poetry and mechanical eccentricity that made them instantly recognizable. The transverse V-twin engine, shaft-driven precision, and unmistakable silhouettes gave Guzzi a presence on the road that turned heads and stirred hearts. Riders didn't adopt these bikes for performance alone. They embraced them for their personality, their flaws, their voice. But admiration alone cannot anchor a brand in a market chasing speed, tech, and convenience. Today, the numbers tell a difficult truth. Fewer than 10,000 units roll off the line annually. In many regions, the name Moto Guzzi draws a nod of nostalgia rather than a current offering. The air-cooled engines, particularly the 90-degree V-twin, hark back to the 1970s and remained largely unchanged while the rest of the industry moved forward. Digital displays, rider modes, cornering ABS, these weren't early innovations for Guzzi. They arrived late, cautiously, or not at all. And when the V100 Mandello finally brought liquid cooling and modern tech into the stable, it stood nearly alone, an isolated attempt in a field of overdue upgrades. Under the umbrella of the Piaggio Group, Guzzi's place is often overshadowed. Vespa continues to sell in volume. Aprilia racks up victories on the track. Guzzi waits its turn. The Mandello factory remains a symbol of pride, but pride doesn't pay for automation. and nostalgia doesn't shorten production delays. Riders who love the brand speak of torque with character and engineering with soul. And those qualities matter until the brand they defend stops defending itself. Moto Guzzi is not yet gone, but the current is pulling. The dealer network thins. The rider base ages. And what endures today is a label that once climbed high, but now coasts downward. Its trajectory growing more horizontal as time presses forward. When the curtain finally falls, it won't be with fanfare. It'll disappear in that slow, aching way the past always does. Did you ever ride any of these bikes when they were at their peak? We'd love to hear your story. Norton Motorcycles. Scandal doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it creeps in wearing a familiar badge. Norton, a name once engraved into the framework of British motorcycling, now bears the imprint of transgressions too deep for redemption. This isn't a tale of mere financial missteps. It's a cautionary saga of ambition turned corrosive, of legacy betrayed by the very hands entrusted to preserve it. The year was 2008 when Stuart Garner took control of Norton, announcing plans that echoed with promises of revival and reverence. He spoke of resurrecting icons, of blending heritage with innovation. Factories saw new life, catalogs filled with seductive renderings of machines not yet built. Deposits poured in. Headlines were generous. But behind the showroom lights, reality told a darker tale. Underneath the marketing gloss, the foundation was riddled with deceit. What followed in the years ahead unfolded not as misfortune, but as calculated collapse. By 2020, the mask fell. The company disintegrated amid revelations of misused pensions, unfulfilled orders, and motorcycles that, when delivered, sometimes couldn't pass basic inspection. Customers were left empty-handed, clutching paperwork in place of bikes. Employees showed up to shuttered gates. A title once tied to pride and prestige now surfaces most often in warnings, lawsuits, and tales of disillusionment. Then came the rescue, at least on paper. Indian powerhouse TVS Motor Company stepped in, purchasing what remained of Norton for $20 million. With fresh investment, a new facility, and bold promises, they set out to cleanse the brand's reputation and chart a different course. A flagship superbike, the V4 SV, was unveiled as the crown jewel of this rebooted identity. Yet delays mounted. Other promised models sat in limbo, and the ghosts of the past refused to stay buried. Many of the early customers who paid under Garner's tenure are still waiting, some for refunds, others for motorcycles that never arrived. Outside of the UK, the brand remains largely absent. Dealerships are scarce. Parts, when needed, often require patience. And despite all the branding and backstory, Norton today walks a tightrope between hope and hesitance. Rebuilding trust isn't an engineering task. It's a moral one. The scars left by betrayal don't fade easily, no matter how finely milled the new aluminum or how beautifully tuned the new engine. Norton may yet rise, but its redemption depends not on nostalgia nor press events, but on whether it can finally deliver, consistently, honestly, and without shadows. Because for every loyalist still cheering from the sidelines, far more have quietly turned away, tired of waiting for a legend to mean something again. Mitsubishi. What happens when a brand doesn't fall? It simply vanishes into the background. No final announcement, no closing ceremony, no last gasp of relevance. That's the path Mitsubishi took in the world of motorcycles. Not with a crash, but with a shrug. And that makes its disappearance all the more haunting. Decades ago, amid Japan's rapid industrial rise, Mitsubishi didn't just stamp its logo on cars, it also shaped the two-wheeled future. The company introduced its scooters and small motorcycles under names like Silver Pigeon, stepping confidently onto a battleground already crowded with Honda's ambition, Yamaha's racing pedigree, and Suzuki's innovation. Mitsubishi had the tools, powerful factories, efficient distribution, and a post-war audience eager for affordable, reliable transportation. In the early years, their machines were sturdy and accessible, born from engineering rather than marketing hype. For a while, the brand held its ground. But then came a change in wind direction. As the motorcycle wars intensified in the 1970s, Mitsubishi began redirecting its attention toward automobiles. While competitors raced forward with bold designs and global expansion, Mitsubishi reduced its focus, then quietly slipped through a side exit. The end arrived not with a scandal or spectacular failure, but through a slow, calculated retreat. Production dwindled. Licensing agreements took precedence. Eventually, the company abandoned the space altogether. By the 1980s, Mitsubishi's presence in the motorcycle world had all but dissolved, leaving behind no ceremony, only silence. In more recent times, whispers of a comeback have stirred. Reports surfaced of electric prototypes, speculative patents, and development notes tucked deep within their EV projects. Enthusiasts speculated Mitsubishi could channel its automotive expertise into a new generation of electric motorcycles, but speculation without follow-through amounts to vapor. As of today, those plans remain unrealized, and the company has offered no indication it intends to return to the saddle. What's left is scattered. A few antique scooters in private collections, an archived photograph or two, maybe an oil-stained repair manual in someone's workshop drawer. Mitsubishi's story isn't one of flame-out or disgrace. It's a slow fade to irrelevance. The brand didn't fight to stay in the game. It simply chose not to show up. Now, as the company faces mounting challenges in the car market, the motorcycle division is little more than a name buried under decades of restructuring and lost focus. Mitsubishi, once positioned to compete alongside Japan's motorcycle powerhouses, now barely registers, a passing reference rather than a contender. Enjoy this wild ride. Let us know by giving it a like and subscribing. Your support keeps the engine running. KTM. When a company built its reputation on speed, precision, and control, watching it skid off course in broad daylight is more than troubling. It's a spectacle. That's where KTM finds itself today, not in a slump, but in a free fall. Formerly hailed as a force in European off-road performance, KTM now finds itself ensnared in the harsh mechanics of financial rescue, with every turn of the wheel straining under pressure. By late 2024, the headlines turned grim. Pierre Mobility AG, KTM's parent company, triggered self-administration proceedings in Austria, a last-ditch mechanism to reorganize under legal supervision. It's the financial equivalent of flatlining on the track. Their stock value collapsed, nosediving over 80% within a single year. Behind the plunge was a mix of global miscalculations, bottlenecked supply chains, unchecked production, rising costs, and a bloated strategy aimed at market saturation rather than measured growth. Activity inside their assembly facilities gradually waned, shifting from high-paced output to a landscape marked by still machinery and muted floors. Motorcycle production, previously clocking over 1,000 units daily, stalled. Dozens of upcoming models, previously unveiled as bold steps toward expansion, were withdrawn from the roadmap without a clear return date. The cost-cutting came swiftly and harshly. More than 300 employees across Europe, including engineers and logistics veterans, were shown the door. KTM, previously praised for challenging conventions, found itself abruptly constrained by the very limits it once tried to surpass. The root of the crisis lies in a gamble that spiraled out of control. KTM had planned to split its focus: premium machines for developed markets, smaller entry-level bikes for rising economies. But thin profit margins on those low-cost models turned into liabilities when inflation surged and consumer confidence dropped. High interest rates dulled spending power, and the shelves began to overflow with unsold inventory. Compounding the issue, KTM had lost a key manufacturing ally. In 2021, Bajaj Auto, its longtime Indian partner, divested from the company, severing a supply chain lifeline. Without Bajaj's volume production and cost advantages, KTM was left navigating a high-cost system with fewer tools in hand. Dealerships soon reported stagnant sales, bikes gathering dust, and customers wary of backlogs. Victories on the track, previously hailed as KTM's shining asset, provided no shelter when financial pressure mounted. Championship titles don't settle operating costs. As debtors close in, the company long celebrated for dominating off-road terrain now wrestles with the harder task of forging a sustainable path forward. Boss Haas V8. What kind of machine straps a muscle car engine to two wheels and dares you to tame it on open pavement? Enter the Boss Haas V8, a roaring, steel-bodied spectacle that made no compromises and offered no apologies. Emerging in the early 1990s, this wasn't engineered for balance or refinement. It was built for bravado. With a heart yanked straight from Chevrolet's small-block V8 arsenal, the Boss Haas boasted displacement figures that bordered on lunacy: 5,700 cubic centimeters of liquid-cooled fury, cranking out anywhere between 350 and 450 horsepower depending on the tune. That level of output rivals full-size pickups and eclipses the entire power band of conventional motorcycles. And yet it wasn't only the raw power that raised eyebrows, it was the scale. Wet weight hovered near 1,100 pounds, nearly twice that of a modern sport bike. Riding this colossus required the body strength of a wrestler and the reflexes of a fighter pilot. Straight-line acceleration felt more drag strip than highway. Top speeds nudged 140 miles per hour, but the real challenge came after the rush. Slowing a machine of that heft wasn't simply about braking, it was about strategy. Dual front rotors and a beefy rear disc offered resistance, but gravity never made it easy. Turning was equally taxing. With a stretched wheelbase and bulk that spanned nearly the width of a compact car, navigating corners felt closer to negotiating with physics than flowing with the road. Riders had to think several turns ahead or risk finding themselves locked in a line they couldn't escape. Add to that a fuel economy averaging a meager 20 miles per gallon, and you had a machine that devoured gasoline as greedily as it devoured nerves. Frequent stops weren't optional, they were survival. And yet, against all logic, the Boss Haas earned a place in motorcycling lore. Devotees embraced its absurdity. The thunder from its exhaust, the unapologetic bulk, and the wild audacity of its existence offered a type of thrill no other bike could replicate. This wasn't a ride, it was a declaration. But beneath the spectacle lies the truth. The Boss Haas V8 wasn't dangerous because it failed. It was dangerous because it succeeded too well at being outrageous. Kawasaki H1 Mach III 500. Few machines have ever hit the pavement with such reckless ambition. In 1969, the Kawasaki H1 Mach III 500 arrived as a bolt of defiance aimed directly at its rivals. This wasn't a refinement of past formulas. It was a leap toward the edge. Designed to dominate the drag strip and stun the street, the H1 brought with it an aggressive two-stroke 499 cubic centimeter triple engine that produced an eye-widening 60 horsepower. Lightweight, at just 384 pounds dry, the machine offered a power-to-weight ratio that bordered on volatile. Acceleration came fast and brutal. 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds placed the H1 among the quickest production motorcycles of its era. But it wasn't the top speed, well above 115 miles per hour, that unsettled riders. It was the explosive delivery. Torque surged suddenly, hammering the rear wheel with 37 pound-feet of force, arriving high in the rev range and without grace. The throttle didn't coax the bike forward, it launched it. The front wheel reared up with little provocation. Grip came and went depending on the rider's nerve and the road beneath. Those who dared twist the throttle found themselves negotiating with physics rather than riding in control. Unfortunately, the rest of the bike struggled to keep pace with its ferocity. The narrow steel frame flexed under duress, and the suspension, primitive by any measure, struggled to manage the load in corners or under braking. Ground clearance was tight, making lean angles risky. The brakes, drums front and rear, were wholly unprepared to handle a machine with such velocity. Stopping distances stretched alarmingly long, especially under stress. Riders needed foresight, open space, and sometimes a bit of providence to bring the H1 to a safe halt. Fuel economy hovered around 26 miles per gallon, but few cared. Comfort wasn't part of the design brief. Riders bought into speed, and what they received was barely restrained chaos. As stories circulated, riders thrown from their seats, tank slappers at speed, rear tires breaking loose mid-corner, the H1 earned a reputation for being unpredictable and unforgiving. For those who mastered its quirks, it offered unmatched thrills. But for many, it was a ticket to danger dressed in Kawasaki green. It stood at the crossroads of power and instability, a machine too fast for its own foundation, built in a time when caution trailed far behind horsepower. In your opinion, which motorcycle brand deserves a second chance before it disappears for good? Suzuki GSX-R1100. Can a machine built for glory become a legend through fear alone? The Suzuki GSX-R1100 didn't tiptoe into the spotlight. It exploded onto the scene with brute force and no apologies. When it first appeared in the late 1980s, the motorcycle world was changing fast, with manufacturers chasing speed, power, and bragging rights at any cost. The GSX-R1100 wasn't subtle about its mission. It was Suzuki's answer to the horsepower arms race, a street-legal missile dressed in racing leathers. At the heart of this behemoth was a 1,136 cubic centimeter oil and air-cooled inline four-cylinder engine, roaring out an astonishing 145 horsepower. That number turned heads in its day and still raises eyebrows today. But what truly set the GSX-R 1100 apart wasn't its brute strength. It was the unapologetic way it delivered that power. It didn't smooth things out or hold your hand. It gave you everything, all at once, and dared you to keep up. Despite its hefty 593-pound wet weight, the bike surged forward with a ferocity that surprised even seasoned riders. Mid-range torque came on hard at 85 pound-feet, and the power band stretched deep into the red line. At full throttle, this monster could flirt with top speeds nearing 175 miles per hour. But that's where the fun ended for many. The frame, while adequate on paper, often struggled to contain the chaos. Built in a pre-electronic age, the GSX-R 1010 lacked traction control, ride modes, or ABS. Every twitch of the throttle, every shift of weight, every misjudged curve, it was all up to the rider. Stability was a known issue at high speeds. The front end would begin to dance under stress, particularly over uneven pavement, and gusty winds could throw the whole machine off balance without warning. The brakes, dual front discs, and a single rear were powerful for their time, but lacked the finesse and feedback modern systems offer. Riders who weren't smooth, experienced, or lucky often found themselves in more trouble than they could manage. The ergonomics didn't do anyone favors either. The stretched-out riding position placed huge demands on wrists, neck, and back. Long-distance rides became endurance trials, but to the GSX-R 1100's faithful, that was the price of admission. Fuel economy, hovering near 33 miles per gallon, was almost irrelevant. Nobody climbed aboard this bike to save gas. They came chasing adrenaline. Over the years, the GSX-R1100 has become a benchmark, not just for its raw performance, but for the cautionary tales it inspired. It taught riders respect, sometimes the hard way. It marked a period when motorcycle engineering prioritized output over forgiveness, and when survival depended more on rider skill than built-in safety. That legacy remains etched in the minds of those who dared to ride it. And for many, the GSX-R1100 didn't earn its legendary status from race wins or glossy ads. It earned it from the scars, the stories, and the thrill of barely holding on. The 1970s gave us disco, lava lamps, and some of the most hideous cars ever to roll off an assembly line. Buckle up. Today we're taking a joyride through 18 of the ugliest automotive crimes of the decade. From design disasters to rolling punchlines, these are the cars that made you wonder, who signed off on that? Bricklin SV1. Some people leave their mark on the automotive world. Malcolm Bricklin left a dent. After introducing the American public to the Subaru 360 and later the Yugo, two cars that made used skateboards look like luxury transport, you'd think he'd call it a day. Instead, he gave us the Bricklin SV1, a plastic-clad, gull-wing-doored curiosity that was marketed as a safety sports car. It turned out to be about as safe and sporty as a folding chair in a hurricane. The design tried to be bold, but landed somewhere between concept car and kid's toy left out in the sun. It featured exaggerated bumpers that looked vacuum-formed by a cartoonist, tiny slit-like windows that gave off spy movie prop energy, and turbine-style wheels straight out of a 1970s Van Mural fantasy. Functionally, the SV1 was a mess. Panels warped before they even made it to the chassis. Gull-wing doors weighed a solid 90 pounds and occasionally refused to open, leaving unlucky owners trapped inside their own plastic panic rooms. And don't even ask about the electrical system, unless you're near a fire extinguisher. The SV1 had one consistent quality: disappointment. It was hard to look at, harder to drive, and nearly impossible to take seriously. Leata Caballero. The Chevy Chevette was never anyone's dream car. It wheezed, rattled, and accelerated like it had second thoughts. But for all its flaws, at least it wasn't trying to win any beauty contests. That is, until Donald E. Steinbach from Port Falls decided it needed a glow-up. Armed with a drum of Bondo, an ocean of fiberglass, and questionable taste, he transformed the humble Chevette into the Caballero, a name he claimed was for his wife, though it sounds more like a typo in a telenovela script. His vision: combine the body lines of a first-gen Monte Carlo with the proportions of a toaster oven. The result? A rolling contradiction. Long in the nose, short in sense. And somehow, this wasn't a one-off. Steinbach actually managed to crank out nearly 100 of these Frankensteins, including a few El Camino-style pickups that looked like they'd lost a bet with common sense. He priced them at nearly double what a stock Chevette cost, which might explain why the project ended in financial disaster. Then again, naming your automotive side hustle after your spouse and gluing on a fake muscle car front end. Some losses are harder to measure in dollars. Oldsmobile Cutlass Aeroback. Somewhere in a GM boardroom in the late 70s, someone must have said, "Let's give America a taste of European flair." And apparently, that taste came in the form of the Aeroback, a car that looked like it was styled by someone who'd only seen hatchbacks described over the phone. In GM's attempt to go continental, they took the successful Cutlass and Buick Century and gave them a sloping rear that wasn't quite a fastback, definitely not a hatchback, and somehow still managed to look like both were melting. Technically, it had a regular trunk lid, but by the time customers figured that out, Most had already turned and walked away. GM was so confident in the Aerobac's appeal that they didn't even bother offering a proper sedan version at launch. That confidence evaporated fast. Sales fizzled, and GM scrambled to push a more conventional design into production by 1980. Oddly, the two-door Aerobac lingered until 1981, like the last guest at a party who doesn't realize the music stopped an hour ago. In the end, the Aerobac became a cautionary tale. When you mix bland ambition with clumsy execution, what you get isn't innovation, it's just awkward. And that, in a nutshell, is how the 80s styling slump began. Reliant Robin. This wasn't just a car, it was a cry for help on wheels. The Reliant Robin, Britain's most infamous three-wheeler, looked like what happens when someone tries to build a car using only memory, cardboard, and a prayer. While three-wheeled vehicles can, in theory, be quirky and even charming, the Robin leaned fully into its awkwardness, and then doubled down with a wobbly stance and a blank, bug-eyed stare. It wasn't just the looks, though those didn't help. The Robin's narrow front end and high roofline made it resemble a wind-up toy blown up to adult scale. Its predecessor, the Reliant Regal, at least had a faint whisper of dignity in its lines. But the Robin felt like it knew it wasn't a real car, and had simply decided to own it. Built for buyers on a tight budget and a loophole in British licensing laws, the Robin technically offered motoring freedom. What it offered in practice was the terrifying sensation of tipping over during a sharp turn and the social status of a shopping cart with a VIN. Still, there's something oddly lovable about how hard it tries. It's not pretty, it's not practical, but in its own clumsy three-legged way, it's unforgettable. Buick Riviera. How do you take one of the best-looking American coupes of the late 60s and turn it into something that looks like it's melting in the sun? That's the riddle Buick answered, unintentionally, in 1970, with the second-generation Riviera. From 1966 to 1969, the Riviera had real presence, taut lines, hidden headlights, and a muscular stance that exuded quiet confidence. Then came the redesign. And suddenly, it looked like it had aged 40 years overnight. The grille appeared to be slowly sliding off the front end, as if gravity had declared war on it. The rear wheel arches were smothered under odd-looking fender skirts that grew over the tires like creeping ivy. The proportions turned doughy and waterlogged, giving the whole car a sluggish, marshy vibe. Less street cruiser, more landlocked houseboat. Naturally, customers noticed. Riviera sales, which had been climbing steadily, fell off a cliff when this swollen, confused-looking version landed in showrooms. The public's verdict was clear. Beauty might be skin-deep, but ugly cuts straight to the bottom line. Thankfully, Buick rebounded quickly. By 1971, the Riviera had reinvented itself again, this time with the polarizing but unforgettable boat-tail design. Love it or not, at least it stopped looking like it was melting. Datsun 200SX. Not every fall from grace makes a sound, but this one thudded. At a time when Datsun seemed untouchable, with the 240Z charming sports car fans and the 510 winning over pragmatists, they released the 200SX, a car that looked like it was designed by someone halfway through fixing a toaster. The grille, shaped like a bargain bin electric shaver, set the tone, and things didn't improve from there. Its slab-sided bodywork and lifeless lines felt less like a design choice and more like a default setting. Sure, it had rear-wheel drive and a 2.0-liter engine on paper, but so does a forklift. Calling it sporty was generous to a fault. It lumbered, it groaned, and it drank gas like it was trying to forget the 70s ever happened. Visibility? Not great, but with so few buyers, complaints were a statistical impossibility. And while most cars aged poorly in this era, the 200SX disintegrated with a certain poetic urgency. It didn't just rust, it flaked away like shame in the rain. In a decade packed with daring flops and design swings, the 200SX managed to stand out by doing nothing bold at all, and somehow still doing it badly. A forgettable car that reminds you, sometimes mediocrity is the loudest kind of ugly. A MC Gremlin. Few cars have ever looked quite as unfinished as the AMC Gremlin, and that seemed to be the point. Introduced in 1970, it appeared as though AMC designers started with a normal compact, then simply ran out of paper halfway through the rear end. The result? A car that looked like someone had sliced it with a giant paper cutter, then shrugged and sent it to production anyway. And yet, beneath its awkward, chopped-off silhouette was a strangely brilliant idea. The Gremlin was affordable, practical, in its own lopsided way, and cheap to manufacture. AMC beat the Big Three to the punch in the subcompact race, offering it at a price nearly one-third less than its rivals. That alone made it a hit. By AMC standards, even a phenomenon. Of course, being a sales success doesn't mean being easy on the eyes. The Gremlin's proportions were borderline comedic, with a long hood, short wheelbase, and a back end that looked like it left the factory mid-transformation. Word has it, AMC rejected an even uglier design before settling on this one, though considering who made that call, we'd take that claim with a grain of irony. Still, the Gremlin was unapologetically weird, and in the 70s, that was a superpower. If this video brought back memories to you, stick around until the end, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support our channel. Volvo 262C. Every now and then, a car gets built not because the world needs it, but because someone got a little too inspired during an overseas visit. That's more or less how the Volvo 262C came to be. Legend has it that when Henry Ford II showed up in Sweden with a fleet of Lincoln Continental Mark IVs, local execs were so dazzled by the square-jawed luxury coupes that they decided, we should make one, our way. The result? A strangely squat two-door Volvo with all the grace of a brick in a tuxedo. Volvo took its respectable 262 GL coupe, shipped it to Bertone in Italy, and asked them to chop the roofline by over 2.5 inches. The outcome was a car that looked perpetually hunched, like it was ducking under a low ceiling. Headroom? Only if you were under 6 feet, or willing to drive with your neck at a 45-degree angle. To Volvo's credit, the interior was plush. Leather seats, wood trim, even a dash of Italian flair. But no amount of luxury could distract from the oddly proportioned body. And yet, somehow, they sold over 6,000 of them. Proof that even questionable ideas can find their audience, especially if they're seated low enough. Leyland P76. Can bad design be exported like a cultural artifact? Apparently so, because when British Leyland brought the P76 to Australia, it didn't just ship a car, it delivered a rolling case study in how not to build one. This full-sized sedan was supposed to be Leyland Australia's bold entry into the local market, but it ended up feeling more like a prank that got out of hand. Visually, the P76 was all sharp angles and strange proportions, like someone tried to draw a wedge using only guesswork and resentment. Sure, it had a party trick. The trunk could reportedly fit a 44-gallon oil drum. Useful, perhaps, if you were smuggling a barbecue pit. But that spacious cargo area couldn't distract from the slapdash assembly and flimsy build quality, hallmarks of Leyland's declining empire. Under the hood, there were some interesting powertrain choices, but the appeal ended there. Squeaks, rattles, and electrical gremlins turned everyday driving into an exercise in lowered expectations. In just 2 years, the P76 flamed out after barely 18,000 units. It wasn't just ugly, it was a symbol of a brand unraveling at the seams. If the goal was to unify the Commonwealth through shared automotive disappointment, well, mission accomplished. Which 70s car do you think should have made this list but didn't? Let us know in the comment. Porsche 914. Not every Porsche looks like it's about to grace the cover of a magazine, and the 914 made sure of that. Released in the early 70s, it was the kind of sports car that turned heads, though not always for the right reasons. From certain angles, it looked less like a product of Stuttgart and more like a high school shop class project that got surprisingly far. To its credit, the 914 was a bold experiment, a mid-engine layout in a compact, affordable package. But styling-wise, it walked a strange line between European minimalist and unfinished prototype. The greenhouse was pulled back awkwardly. The bodywork looked like it had been trimmed with a T-square, and the space between the rear wheels and B-pillars stretched on like a design afterthought. There was no mistaking it for a 911, or anything else, really. It didn't try to be sleek or sensual. Instead, it leaned into its angular awkwardness like a dorky kid at prom who decided to dance anyway. And somehow, that gave it charm. We'll admit it, the 914 isn't a car you dream about as a kid. But years later, you might catch yourself smiling when you see one. It's weird. It's honest. And oddly enough, it works. Ford Thunderbird. What happens when a car company forgets that subtlety can be a good thing? You get the 1970 Ford Thunderbird, a vehicle that went from smooth and sophisticated to looking like it lost a fight with a pelican. The late 60s T-Birds weren't showstoppers, but they had a certain low-key charm. They didn't try too hard. They didn't need to. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Ford designers slapped a giant chrome beak on the front end, as if the car had aspirations of becoming a bird of prey, or at least cosplaying one. The nose jutted out with such theatrical drama, it practically demanded its own zip code. Suddenly, the once dignified T-Bird had the awkward energy of a dinner guest who talks too loud and doesn't know when to leave. The real irony? Thunderbird was meant to evoke power, elegance, even mystique. What we got in 1970 looked more like a rolling cartoon, heavy up front, disconnected in the rear, and confused all the way through. Sales held steady for a bit, but the styling misstep was a sign of things to come. The T-Bird never quite found its footing again, proving that sometimes bold just turns into bizarre. Do any of these cars make you nostalgic, even if they're not exactly pretty? Share your story. British Leyland Princess. How bad does a car have to be before even its parent company doesn't want to put its name on it? Enter the British Leyland Princess, a vehicle so unloved it had to become its own brand just to avoid embarrassing the others. Initially launched under Austin, Morris, and Wolseley, the Princess eventually stood alone, not because it earned the spotlight, but because everyone else quietly backed away. Its wedge-shaped body looked like it was styled with a ruler and a grudge. At first glance, you'd think it was a hatchback, but no. This was a sedan in disguise, hiding a laughably small trunk opening that made loading groceries feel like a game of Tetris on hard mode. Combine that with its awkward proportions and questionable reliability, and you had a car that failed at form, function, and common sense. To make matters worse, the Princess rolled onto the scene right as British Leyland was crumbling from within. Mechanical issues, poor build quality, and union troubles created the perfect storm, and the Princess was caught in the middle. In the end, the car's name might have suggested grace or elegance, but let's be honest, the only royal thing about it was the mess it left behind. AMC Pacer. Few cars from the 1970s tried harder to be different than the AMC Pacer, and few ended up looking quite so unintentionally hilarious. At first glance, It resembles something you'd expect to see in an animated movie, not parked in a real driveway. With its oversized glass bubble and pudgy, compact body, the Pacer looked less like a car and more like a science experiment that escaped the lab. AMC pitched it as the first wide small car, hoping to stand out in a growing field of imports. And stand out it did, like a goldfish tank on wheels. The panoramic glass was meant to offer improved visibility, but it mostly offered heatstroke. Inside, summer felt like sitting in a greenhouse with wheels. By 1978, the design team doubled down on the awkwardness by shoehorning in an optional V8. This required a taller, bulkier hood and upright grille, giving the car a strange, puffed-up look, as if it had eaten a second lunch and hadn't quite digested it. Efficiency, unsurprisingly, wasn't its strength. Still, the Pacer carved out a weird little cult following. It was a car for misfits, well before misfits were cool, and long before anyone knew what a quirky classic really meant. Vanden Plas 1500. Luxury isn't always about what's under the hood. Sometimes it's just about distracting you from it. That was the philosophy behind the Vanden Plas 1500, British Leyland's attempt to disguise the deeply mediocre Austin Allegro in a tailored suit. They didn't improve the engineering, the handling, or the reliability. Instead, they added leather, walnut trim, and a grille so upright and regal, it looked like it was auditioning for a Bentley. Inside, the car played its part convincingly. Plush carpet underfoot, soft leather seats, and even little fold-down picnic tables in the back, because nothing says refinement like enjoying cold sandwiches while waiting for a tow truck. It was a clever illusion. Take a car nobody wanted and sell it to someone who wanted to feel like they had taste. But beneath the veneer, it was still the same awkward, underpowered Allegro. It rattled, it groaned, and it cornered like a filing cabinet on roller skates. The fancy nameplate didn't change the fact that it was badge engineering at its most shameless. In the end, the Vanden Plas 1500 was less a luxury experience and more a case study in automotive overcompensation. A Jaguar for those with champagne dreams and lukewarm tea budgets. Subaru GL Coupe. Style can be a risky experiment, especially when your background is all lab coats and calculators. In the early 70s, Subaru had carved out a reputation in the US for building dependable, no-frills compacts. They weren't flashy, but they got the job done, like the automotive equivalent of a rice cooker. But then someone at Subaru must have looked over at a Datsun brochure and said, "We can be cool too." The result? The Subaru GL Coupe. This was Subaru's attempt at styling, but the proportions ended up looking more like an accident than a design statement. The front was oddly upright, the body seemed stretched in strange places, and then, suddenly, it just ended. The rear overhang was so short, you'd think they ran out of metal halfway through and just slapped on a bumper to call it done. To make matters worse, the taillights looked like leftover parts from a vending machine. From the side, the GL resembled a car that had been compressed lengthwise during shipping and never fully bounced back. Sure, it was practical, affordable, and reliable. But in trying to be stylish, it lost the very charm that made early Subarus lovable and gained a design that looked like it had been faxed in blurry. Saab Sonnet 3. Did someone forget to tell Saab that balance is kind of important in car design? Because when the Sonnet 3 rolled into the early 70s, it looked like two completely different cars had been welded together during a lunch break. Built with the American market in mind, the Sonnet tried to appeal to US tastes, but ended up misreading the assignment in the most spectacular way. Let's start with the nose. It was long, really long, like the automotive equivalent of someone leaning way too far into a conversation. That giant overhang, exaggerated even further by a clunky 5MPU safety bumper, gave the front end a droopy, drooling look. Then there was the rear, short, stubby, and abruptly chopped off, like it left the factory before the designers could finish it. This front-heavy, rear-starved layout threw the whole car's visual balance out the window, and while the Sonnet's sporty intentions were genuine, the styling made it hard to take seriously, especially in a market packed with sharper, more cohesive designs. It wouldn't be until the Saab 900 arrived later in the decade that American buyers finally started giving the brand a second look. By then, the Sonnet had already driven off into the land of automotive oddities. Ford Pinto. What's the price of shaving a few bucks off a fuel tank design? Enter the Ford Pinto, America's answer to rising gas prices and import competition, packaged in a tidy little car that came with one explosive flaw. On paper, the Pinto was what drivers wanted: affordable, lightweight, and easy on gas. But behind the cheerful marketing was a dangerously compact design that placed the gas tank inches from the rear bumper, as if Ford was daring fate to rear-end it. The real scandal wasn't just the engineering oversight. It was the internal memo that coldly calculated lawsuits to be cheaper than fixing the problem. The Pinto didn't just burn rubber, it literally burned. In crashes, it was known to erupt into flames with all the warning of a birthday candle. Design-wise, it was a plain Jane Econobox with no visual thrills, just an egg-shaped body, basic trim, and a face that screamed entry-level. But it wasn't the styling that made the Pinto unforgettable. It was the lawsuits, the headlines, and the public outrage that followed. Eventually, Ford issued a recall. But by then, the Pinto's legacy was set in stone, as a cautionary tale taught in ethics classes and courtrooms alike. It wasn't the ugliest car of the 70s, but it might have been the most infamous. Sebring Vanguard City Car. Can a car be both ahead of its time and completely ridiculous? Meet the City Car, a bold attempt at electric mobility in the 1970s that somehow managed to feel futuristic and laughable at the same time. Built by Sebring Vanguard, a name that sounds more like a yacht club than a car company, the City Car looked like something you'd see patrolling a warehouse floor, not merging onto a freeway. Its wedge-shaped body seemed designed with a protractor and a budget of maybe 40 bucks. Under the hood, well, technically under the seat, you got a 2.5 horsepower electric motor, later upgraded to a thundering 6. Top speed? A heart-racing 28 miles per hour, assuming you had a tailwind and no dignity to lose. Range was limited, the interior was Spartan, and safety features were mostly theoretical. Yet despite all that, someone thought it was a good idea to extend the bumpers and rebrand it as the Commuta car, because apparently the only thing missing was a bit more awkward. And still, you can't help but admire its ambition. The City Car didn't just challenge convention, it bulldozed right past it in the slow lane. In a strange way, it paved the path for the EVs we know today by showing everyone exactly what not to do first. Ford Mustang II. Some cars try to be everything at once and end up being nothing at all. That was the unfortunate fate of the Mustang II Ghia, Ford's attempt to dress muscle in a tuxedo and hope no one noticed it skipped leg day. After downsizing the iconic Mustang in the mid-70s, Ford figured they could win over the luxury crowd by slapping on a padded vinyl roof, opera windows, and color-matched bumpers. The result? A coupe that looked less like a pony car and more like something your aunt might drive to bridge night. Visually, the Ghia trim felt like a collage of every odd styling cue from the era. The faux formal roofline gave it the presence of a shrunken Lincoln, while the wheel covers, borrowed from the Granada, no less, made it clear that even the parts bin was uninspired. It didn't look fast, it didn't look sleek, and it certainly didn't look proud to wear the Mustang name. And yet, the Mustang II sold surprisingly well. But let's be honest, That success probably had more to do with timing, fuel prices, and badge loyalty than with any real admiration for the Ghia's styling choices. Call it a Mustang if you must, but don't expect it to gallop. These machines pushed limits, and some paid the price. Which of these bikes would you dare to ride, or avoid at all costs? Let us know your thoughts below. And if you enjoyed this wild ride, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you won't miss what's coming next.